Hello, everyone. I see folks are joining, so we'll give you a few minutes just to get into our webcast today. Welcome, welcome. Hope everyone is having a great Wednesday. I think it's Wednesday. I can't keep track anymore. Welcome, everyone. My name is Katie Nichols. I'm a SANS instructor, also Director of Intelligence at Red Canary. I'm going to be your host today for our SANS Threat Analysis Rundown, our monthly STAR webcast, and I'll be joined, you can see them on video, by Robert and Alexi from ESET. Our topic for today is going to be diving into behind the scenes, right? Robert and Alexi have been involved in some major takedown operations with law enforcement, talking about that public-private cooperation. So that is our deep dive topic for the day. Let's dive right in. First things first, this is being recorded and the slides will be available. Those will be available on the page where you registered. Within a couple days, we will share those. So those are always the top questions. Yes, it's being recorded. Yes, we will share the slides so you can share this with your friends later. I know it's been kind of a busy week. If this is your first time joining the STAR webcast, here's kind of our goal, trying to bring you the inside scoop on what's happening with regards to cyber threats. You know, some months we've done a deep dive into specific groups or malware families. Sometimes we take a look at how we operate as an industry, as a community. So lots of different voices. So excited to have Robert and Alexi join me today. The way we're going to structure things, I'll give a quick rundown of just a few things happening this week. Then I'll pass it over to Robert and Alexi for our deep dive, and then wrap up, send you off with some action items. Probably not a shock that the big thing in the news this week has been the global supply chain compromise of SolarWinds. And lots of folks have talked about this, so I don't want to reiterate, what others have said, but just a few things to emphasize this week. First off, it's interesting because as a lot of you are analysts, Intel analysts, we talk about relying only on trusted sources, but I've seen when things like this happen that are really concerning, people start to trust any little thing they see. So what I'm telling myself and my team is, right, trust things that come out from governments, from Microsoft, from FireEye. Great blog post from Velexity that I'd recommend you check out about this. SANS, Jake Williams did a great webinar. There's a blog post up about that. So rely on trusted sources. And if you see something, one random person tweeted, maybe look into it. But if one person on the internet said something, that's not usually a reliable source. So remember to trust those sources as you're trying to get information about this compromise. Next important point. If you've heard me talk about group naming or attribution before, there's a lot of speculation, a lot of unsourced information and news reports that the Russian government is behind this breach. I think it's really significant, and FireEye, who is the company that named APT29, is calling this an uncategorized threat. That piece of information should be significant and tell us that FireEye, who named APT29, isn't confident enough in the attribution to a country or any specific intelligence service. And what I would say is, unless you have a specific need to know the country behind this, I would put that out of your minds, right? Some of you, if you work for governments, if you're working with law enforcement, as Robert and Alexi are going to talk about, maybe you care about that. But honestly, for this compromise, focus on your security and focus less on the attribution behind it. I know it's interesting, but I would put that out of your mind because there's a lot of other work to do. The other thing I would say, if I were a ransomware operator, for example, I would probably be drooling right now. There's still a lot of other threats out there. And so take this seriously, right? This is a global supply chain compromise, pretty serious thing, but don't ignore everything else that's happening on your networks because other adversaries might be taking advantage of this opportunity. Last thing I would say, I know it's been a busy week for everyone, myself as well. It started Sunday night, which was really fun. I'm sure Alexi and Robert woke up to it Monday morning. This is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. Like, new information is coming out all the time. And so just take it all with a grain of salt. Remember that, this is going to be a marathon, new information coming out all the time. So please take care of yourselves. All right. So with that, let's move on from SolarWinds because there's a lot else happening in the world. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Robert and Alexi to deep dive into this topic of law enforcement cooperation. So go ahead and take over here. Really excited to have them both here. They have a lot of expertise. I first met Robert, I think, at a TACCon 2 years ago, when he spoke, and I'm excited to hear their insights today. I can see your slides, so take it away. Finding the unmute button. It's always fun because when you present, it goes away.
Yes. Okay.
There you go.
You hear me, right? Perfect.
Yep, we hear you.
Okay. So it's a pleasure being here. And yeah, let's get right to it because we have a lot of interesting things to cover. And I totally agree with what you were saying, that there are so many different types of threats out there. And that's kind of what we were going for in this presentation, because I think many of the people in the audience had a chance to hear us talk at various conferences. And the topics that we typically discuss and typically talk about are APTs, whether that's Fancy Bear or Sandworm or a bunch of the other APT groups. So this is one area of our focus, the focus of our research, but it's also not the only area of our research. So some of the other areas are, for example, vulnerability research. And today we're going to be focusing on crimeware. So the other major big area, not just state-sponsored APT attacks, but also financially motivated crimeware, which is probably in terms of volume, it's a bigger threat to most of the internet users out there than the sophisticated stuff that we security professionals like reading, writing about, and researching as well. But the financially motivated thing is just the thing that a regular person needs to concern themselves with the most. So that's going to be our focus. This is a pretty fresh presentation. We put this stuff together, and it basically takes us through some very interesting experiences that we had with cooperating with law enforcement. So let's get right to it. My name is Robert Lipowski. I'm a senior malware researcher for ESET, and I lead the research team at ESET's headquarters in Bratislava. And as I said already, so our focus of the team is quite broad. Cybercrime, which we'll be discussing today, but also APT tracking, threat hunting, but also vulnerability research. And Alexi?
And yes, my name is Alexi. I have a similar role as Robert. I'm based in Montreal, and I lead the team of malware researchers here, looking at different threats.
Okay. So these are the types of headlines we all like reading, right? But how do these botnet takedowns or cybercriminals arrests, how were they achieved? So that's what we're going to discuss today. We're going to discuss the role that a private cybersecurity company, such as ESET, can play in it. And the very nature of cybercrime, more often than not, involves many different jurisdictions, and victims, cybercriminals, and the malicious infrastructure that they're using, these are rarely all located in the same country. So it's very common for multiple law enforcement agencies to cooperate on a single case. And on some occasions, and for various reasons, private industry partners, cybersecurity companies, are brought into these investigations. And we're going to cover the cases that we've been involved over the past couple of years. Not all of them, of course, but the most noteworthy examples. So what are the ways that a private cybersecurity company can contribute to a law enforcement investigation? Well, one is infrastructure mapping. So we provide support in mapping the malicious infrastructure of cybercrime activities, and we can do it in a scalable way. So what does that mean exactly? Well, imagine you're investigating a botnet and your goal is to disrupt it. Or say you're more ambitious and you want to take it down completely. So what do you need to do? Well, first you need to map the infrastructure supporting the botnet and then take it all down at the same time. I mean, you can think of it, it's a kind of a cliche that cybersecurity is a cat and mouse game with the cyber criminals. And with botnets, it's also a game of whack-a-mole. Like if you take down some of the infrastructure, then other Cnc servers pop up elsewhere. And for example, for the takedown and the disruption to be as effective and efficient as possible, you need to take down as large a chunk of the infrastructure at a single time as possible. So this is really important. Now, for some botnets, this is simple for, when it's a really small one. You can do it by, just running a few malware samples in a sandbox and extract the domain names, the IP addresses, and then take those down. But in the cases that we'll be discussing today, these are the cases that we've mostly been concerning ourselves with. Things are not that simple. So oftentimes, the malware you're targeting is, in fact, it can be a kit. It can be a kit available for sale on the dark web. And it can be used by hundreds of different actors, each of those running their own botnets with their own command and control infrastructure. And discovering the whole infrastructure needs to be done at scale. And the only way to do that is to have access to as many samples, as many malware samples as possible, and to automate that whole process. So this is something that we're going to talk about when we discuss the various examples. And the second task that we are doing is performing in-depth threat analysis. And this serves to provide a detailed picture of a cybercriminal operation. And it can reveal crucial information such as the true purpose of an attack, because that's very important. And it can provide details on the monetization scheme, or it can provide the identification of the victims, which is not always straightforward. So these are the examples, the cases we'll be discussing today that involved our cooperation with law enforcement. And here is a quick overview of the results of our infrastructure mapping and the data that we were passing on to law enforcement. So you can see that for the Andromeda botnet, or also known as Gamaru or Wauchos, there were a lot of samples that we analyzed, and which also share the domains and the IP addresses. For Trickbot, a more recent example, there were 125,000 samples that were tracked by our systems, over 3,500 domains and IP addresses, and we uncovered, we extracted over 40,000 configuration files. So this was all data that was very valuable for the effort. But we'll get more into the details later. And the third example that we'll be discussing is called Operation Wendigo. And in this case, the tracking was done quite differently. Most of it was done manually. And the result of this tracking was that we uncovered tens of thousands of infected Linux servers, some of which were used to send out spam. So these were tens of millions of spam messages being sent out on a daily basis. Others of the other servers were used to redirect hundreds of thousands of legitimate HTTP requests from visitors to unwanted content, unwanted web content, and all of this data for a single day. So very extensive operation and a very interesting investigation. And Alexis will share really interesting things on that one. So let's take a closer look how these results are actually achieved. So how this tracking works. As I said, it's important to have a lot of samples. And every day we receive suspicious files from various sources. VirusTotal is one. Threat Exchange Partners is another source. But in terms of volume, the major source is from our own customers themselves when they share telemetry data with us in suspicious files. Now, if you had to guess how many new, unique, malicious files come into our lab on a daily basis. So on an average day, that number is over 350,000 unique malicious files. So obviously, all of this cannot be processed manually, and automation is required. And the first step is running these samples through a series of automated systems. You can think of them as custom sandboxes, each of them built with specific features in order to get as much information as possible from these samples. And then afterwards, if detection is needed for that incoming sample, it will be added whether automatically or with human oversight. So this is the standard workflow for all of the samples that are coming in. But for malware samples that belong to a botnet, so for some that we identify that are part of a botnet, we extended that pipeline for purposes that go beyond just detection. So here, this is an automated botnet tracking system that we put together, and it allows us to extract very exhaustive intelligence on those samples, including real-time data related to the command and control infrastructure. So these samples, they're running in a controlled environment, but in this case, it's more than just a sandbox, because you're not just running the samples that we acquired, but quite often we are actually doing our own re-implementation of, for example, the command and control protocol. So basically we are programming and we are making the CNC believe that it's talking to an actual bot, whereas we are monitoring the actions. And we are using unpackers and decryptors that we've written specifically for those most prevalent botnets that we're tracking, and extracting the relevant information from those. And of course, the exit points at various geographic locations are used, because some botnets or even individual campaigns of the botnets sometimes only target specific countries. So this system, it always needs to be up to speed with the current communication protocol of the botnets that we're tracking. And if it changes, this is something that we are monitoring continuously. And if it changes, then the emulator, the parser, is updated. So what are the artifacts that are extracted from this processing? So I hinted at it before when I showed you the statistics. So one is samples. I mean, we have samples coming in, but this is also one of the ways of acquiring new samples when we'll be probing the Cnc server, asking for an update, for example. So this gives us a chance of getting a new version of a particular banking Trojan, for example, even before other users have a chance to get it and get infected by that. So we can get our hands on that. So this serves for detection mostly, but also it serves for analyzing how the malware is evolving. So this is also really important to stay ahead of the game. And we can see what new techniques are being used and added and implemented. The other artifact is the Cnc servers. So the domains, the IP addresses, and these, of course, they continuously keep on being updated as well. And again, the benefits for this are twofold. One is for protecting our users, because the communication with malicious Cnc servers is blocked for users of our security software. But also this information on the Cnc servers, that's something that we can and we have been sharing with law enforcement for takedowns. And this is one of the most interesting pieces of information that a cybersecurity company can provide. Then it's the configuration files. So basically you have samples. These samples are talking to configuration servers. And quite often with banking Trojans, they're basically like a skeleton. So it has some functionality, but it relies on configuration files, on configs telling them what to do, what to target, and so on. So these configs are something that we are also tracking, and something that we are parsing, extracting, and then using this as well. Within those configurations, we will often find the targets, quite often found in web injects. So this particularly applies to the banking Trojans. And this allows us to provide kind of like an early warning to banks, for example. So again, we don't only protect our own users, but also the bank's clients. So we'll share that information with the banks, and then the bank can take extra protective measures. And so we pass on the information that some campaign is about to happen just as the perpetrators begin that campaign. So just as they add the target to the web injects, to the configs, And ideally, the bank will take action also on their behalf before the campaign actually really sets off. So that's kind of the theoretical rundown of how this works. But enough of theory, and let's get to the examples, which I think are really, really interesting. So Alexi, on to you.
Yep, give me a moment to start that screen sharing. All right, that should be working.
Yep.
Excellent. So one of our first really successful case of cooperation with law enforcement that used our botnet tracker system was 4 or 5 years ago. And at that time, of course, the system was in its early days, much more basic than it is right now. But still, it allowed us to join a group involving multiple partners, Europol, the FBI, DOJ, and other private industry partners. And the goal was to disrupt the Andromeda ecosystem. So before I talk about the actual disruption efforts, let's talk about Andromeda for a second. So first, the Europol press release was inaccurate. There never was only one Andromeda botnet, so let's fix that headline right away. There was actually many distinct botnets. Like Robert mentioned before, some malware families are sold as kits, and it was a case for Andromeda. Actually, an early version of the Andromeda malware was, like the builder, was even leaked. So overall, it was really easy to obtain a copy of the malware, easy to deploy. It was extensible and affordable, so very popular. At the peak of its activity, our telemetry showed Andromeda detections pretty much all over the world, although 4 specific countries were much less affected than others, and that was Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. And the reason for that is that the malware had code to look at the system's keyboard when it first executed on a system, and it did not proceed with the infection if the keyboard layout corresponded to ones used in any of those 4 countries. That in itself is quite common to see that in malware, to avoid executing in different countries. But at that time, we had no idea how much this small detail would have a huge impact on the conclusion of the operation, which you'll see why in just a few minutes. Now, Andromeda had several core features which could be augmented with optional plugins, but essentially Andromeda was built for credential stealing, downloading additional malware, and performing key logging. The spreading mechanisms used to deploy Andromeda, of course, varied from one cybercriminal to another, depending on their own preferred strategies. We saw operators using social media, instant messaging, removable drives, typical spam campaigns, and even exploit kits. And in a similar way, the end goal of each operator varied. But what we saw, we actually saw a large proportion of Andromeda-based botnets just being used to deploy additional malware, effectively running a pay-per-install service. Now back to the disruption effort. So before law enforcement action could even begin, we had to do one thing. It was to build the most comprehensive list of all the network infrastructure used to control all the Andromeda botnets. And that list needed to be accurate, up to date, and also to be curated to exclude friendly hosts. So we did not want to disrupt, for example, a sinkhole server run by fellow security researchers, for example. And so we implemented the Andromeda specific code in Botnet Tracker. And for months, we processed all the new incoming Andromeda variants that we could get our hands on, extracting the C2 configuration and building that master list, which we shared with the working group. And our list was merged with similar intelligence coming from the other partners to make one huge, very complete list. And now on disruption day, that list included 1,200, just over 1,200 domain names and IP addresses. And these were used to control almost 500 distinct Andromeda-based botnets. So with the disruption, the working group gained control of a significant portion of those 1,200 IP addresses, and the traffic actually got redirected to our own sinkhole, causing first the botnet operators to completely lose control over their infected machines, but also that sinkhole allowed us to get access to very valuable information on victims. For one thing, it allowed us to start a notification and remediation effort, and ultimately over 1 million machines connected to the sinkhole. So that's quite a lot of infected machines out there. And so after that specific day, as far as we were concerned, the operation was a success. We actually saw an immediate and very sharp decline in Andromeda-related detections among our customers. And actually, to our surprise, a few days later, we learned that the alleged author of the malware got arrested. And we were actually not aware that this was going on at the same time as we were working on the disruption part of the operation. And that news came as a pleasant surprise because we believe that disrupting botnet infrastructure does have an impact on the safety of internet users. But of course, bringing malware authors and operators to justice has the potential to have a much longer term impact. And so we just sat back and followed that story like everybody else. So the suspect, named Sergei Yarets, spent 6 months in jail until his trial started in Belarus. Now, I mentioned that at the very least, 1 million computers were infected by Andromeda. But you also remember that the malware would not infect computers with the keyboard layouts corresponding to 4 countries, including Belarus. Well, the judge during the trial actually said that he was impressed by the fact that the malware had those built-in measures to avoid infecting computers in Belarus and other CIS countries. And he actually offered Yarets a deal. Charges would be dropped if he cooperated with the investigators, and if he remitted all the profits he made by the sale of the malware to other cybercriminals, which was established, I don't know how, but to a grand total of $5,000 US. And so obviously, Yarets took the deal and sent this tweet upon his release, which is Russian for "I'm free."
That was a Belarusian judge, right?
Yes, absolutely. And so if we sum up that case, so the cooperation between multiple partners allowed us really to gather the exhaustive list of the Andromeda's sovereign infrastructure and to take down a really significant portion of that infra in just one shot. And we removed over 1 million infected hosts from harm's way. And as a bonus, the malware author was identified and brought to justice. Of course, even though, well, something that Yarets did not get the sentence he deserved, but that's a topic for another discussion. Robert, your turn now.
Okay. So, yes, Andromeda was a very interesting case. So, but now moving on to the second example, this one, again, very interesting, and this is a more recent one. Again, this was a joint operation. We teamed up with Microsoft and the other industry partners, and actually played a similar role as with the Andromeda case. So we shared intelligence on the infrastructure supporting this malware family, which needs no introduction. So we're talking about Trickbot. And in this part of the talk, I'll talk a little bit about the malware. I know many of you are familiar with it, so I'll just do a quick recap, or maybe I'll mention something that some of you may not have realized or forgot. And of course, I'm going to be talking about the tracking of their infrastructure that we were doing. I showed the numbers already, so just to recap, just in 2020, our botnet tracking system analyzed over 125,000 Trickbot samples. And from those, decrypted more than 40,000 configuration files used by the different Trickbot modules, and you'll hear more about the complications of the Trickbot's configs in just a second. So now Trickbot, it's been a nuisance for internet users for a really long time. Our first detection for Trickbot was created in late 2016. And during these years, Trickbot compromises were reported in a steady manner, making it one of the largest and longest-lived botnets out there. Here you can see data from our telemetry, and you can see that Trickbot has been a global threat. In fact, we've observed detections in most countries of the world. How did it spread is the obvious question. Well, again, throughout its existence, Trickbot was distributed in a number of ways. One of the more notable ones and more recent ones is an execution chain that we've seen frequently with Trickbot. It's been dropped on systems that were already compromised by ESET, another large infamous botnet. So this is a really good example of cooperation between various cybercriminals, various cybercriminal enterprises, for them acting as business partners. Another thing that we need to discuss: what does Trickbot do? Well, in the past, Trickbot was mostly used as a banking Trojan. So that means stealing credentials from online bank accounts and then abusing those to try to perform fraudulent transfers. But Trickbot's modular architecture actually allows it to perform a variety of malicious actions using a variety of its plugins. So it can steal all kinds of credentials, not only limited to online banking, from the compromised computer. And more recently, it's been observed that it was, again, acting as a delivery mechanism for other malware for more damaging attacks, such as ransomware. So, but let's go back to the banking Trojan capability and web injects. So this was facilitated by one of the oldest plugins that were developed for the Trickbot platform. So web injects, they allow malware to dynamically change what the user of a compromised system sees when they visit specific websites. And it's not just the visible things, but it's the HTML basically, or the script or whatever is loaded in the web page. So even the things that you don't see, or you can basically change the functionality of the web page. And to operate this plugin, this web inject plugin relies on configuration files downloaded by the main module of Trickbot. And they contain information about which websites should be modified and how. So here's an extraction of one such decrypted config containing the targeted URLs and the malicious CNC URLs that the bot should contact after the victim accesses the targeted URLs. So through our monitoring of Trickbot campaigns, we collected tens of thousands of different configs, allowing us to know which websites were targeted by the operators. Here in this graph, you can see the number of websites extracted from the configs in 2020. And the targeted URLs mostly belonged to financial institutions. Notice that there is a sharp drop in the number of targets found in these configuration files starting in March. This coincides with the moment when Trickbot operators dropped the web inject module from the list of default plugins automatically downloaded by the main module. So this is why we have actually no data in March, and we had to adjust our processes to maintain visibility on the targeted URLs. And this drop in number is likely due to Trickbot starting to focus on another means of monetization during that time frame, which I already mentioned, ransomware. So in these ransomware cases, a Trickbot compromise would first be leveraged to perform a reconnaissance and then lateral movement in an organization's network. So acting, like we're used to with APTs, basically. and then to drop the Ryuk ransomware on as many systems as possible. So this is the large difference. So it's not a, highly targeted attack, but it's a mass spreading one. Ryuk, I think, again, needs no introduction. And in fact, it's been a topic of the Star webcast already. So if you haven't seen that one, then go back and watch that past episode. From the data we collected, it appears that Trickbot's operators moved from attempting to steal money from bank accounts to compromising a whole organization with Trickbot and then using it to execute Ryuk and demand a ransom to unlock the affected systems. So not really an uncommon change of modus operandi for cybercriminals. Now let's talk more about Trickbot's configuration files. They're on multiple levels. So you kind of have a scene from inception. The main module of Trickbot contains an encrypted hard-coded configuration. This contains a list of Cnc servers, as well as the default list of plugins that should be downloaded. Now, some of these plugins, they also use their own configuration files. And these plugins, they rely on the main module to download these secondary configuration files from the Cnc servers. And the plugins achieve this by passing a small so-called, what we call module configuration structure, which we had to extract from the plugin binaries overlay section. So this lets the main module know what it should download. Again, the main module uses its hard-coded Cnc servers and connects to one of them to download a second list of Cnc servers. It contacts this second layer of CNCs to download the default plugins specified in the hard-coded config. And then it's not over. And then other modules can be downloaded later upon receiving a command to do so from the Trickbot operators on demand. So if all of that sounds a bit confusing, it is a bit confusing. And being able to gather all these configuration files allowed us to map the network infrastructure of Trickbot. All these different layers were what made the effort all the more challenging. Now, we discussed the configs. As for command and control servers, we've also been tracking these since early 2017. And this, of course, was also vital in the whole disruption effort. And another interesting artifact we were able to gather through crawling this botnet is this unique identifier present in each Trickbot sample, so-called G-tag. It's a text string found in the initial hard-coded configuration file, and it identifies different Trickbot campaigns or modes of compromise. For example, the MOR, M-O-R, campaigns we believe to be Trickbot compromises due to ESET. Or the G-tags can also sometimes indicate the target of a campaign. For example, the campaign with a G-tag UK03-1 targeted financial institutions in the United Kingdom. So here you can see a timeline of all G-tags, which we extracted from Trickbot configs from September 2019 to September 2020, just before passing this information to the working group. Also, if you look at the MOR group, MOR, we can see the abrupt stop of the ESET campaigns in April 2020, which is quite well known. So in summary, tracking Trickbot is, or was, actually is, because we're still continuing this, it's no simple task, but it was worth it. The operation was a success. 94% of the Trickbot infrastructure got taken down. So now on to Alexis.
Right. Good. So, botnets, based on Andromeda or Trickbot, it's relatively straightforward to, they are really relatively straightforward to track. because we have lots of samples. We can process them automatically and see what they're actually doing. But in some cases, we stumble upon samples that we know for sure are malicious, but for which we don't have a lot of copy of or variants of. Sometimes we just have one or two different files to analyze, and it's really hard to track them. And sometimes we don't even know what the purpose of the malware is. And so in these cases, we need to perform in-depth analysis. And this is quite time consuming because it has to be done manually. It always involves reverse engineering, but also analysis of communication protocols, crypto algorithms, even deploying custom-made honeypots to get a better grip of what's going on. So it's really time consuming, but sometimes it really pays off because this allows us to expose some fairly complex operations that would have otherwise stayed under the radar, maybe for years. So to explain what that really means, let me tell you about a case we worked with the FBI that eventually led to the arrest and conviction of a Russian co-conspirator. Okay, so Operation Wendigo is a name we gave to a very large-scale malicious operation that we first discovered in 2013. It's still one of the largest investigations we ever performed at ESET. Near the end of it, about half a dozen malware researchers were working on that full-time. And it actually started when we analyzed a pretty complex Linux OpenSSH backdoor, followed by the discovery of a pretty interesting malicious Apache module. And eventually we found a connection between the two. And that's when everything unraveled. And a small parenthesis, we're always particularly interested in analyzing non-Windows malware. These are less common. They use different techniques than the ones we're used to seeing. And we always get to read messages from angry Apple or Linux fans arguing that their favorite operating system is secure and that the malware we just documented is not relevant at all because it didn't exploit any OS vulnerability. So that part is always entertaining, that's for sure. So anyway, this is the schema of the whole operation. In total, there were about half a dozen distinct server-side Linux malware families involved. We confirmed tens of thousands of servers infected by one or more of these malware, including servers belonging to cPanel and to the Linux kernel organization. So in a nutshell, Operation Wendigo relied on three main malware families, each with specific objectives. First, there was eBury. That was the core component of everything. It was the SSH backdoor with a credential stealer component. Then we had Cdork, which was a malicious HTTP backdoor that was actually portable to Apache, Nginx, and Light HTTPD. That was used to redirect visitors to exploit kits, online ads, and in some cases to adult content. And then we had Calfbot, which was a spam sending component written in Perl. So I'm really telling you, this was the most complex malicious infrastructure we ever saw. It took us literally months to put the pieces together. And halfway through the investigation, we were still not really sure what was going on in there, what the actual purpose of this scheme was. But eventually we understood enough and we published a white paper. And shortly after that, the FBI out of the blue reached out to us asking for additional details and for some assistance in their own investigation. And as you'll see, this cooperation was really different from what we did in the cases of Andromeda and Trickbot. So of course, our investigation gave us a good overview of the malicious infrastructure supporting the operation. And this is something that was useful. But in Operation Wendigo, most of the malicious infrastructure was actually hosted on the victims themselves. So our list of nodes, malicious nodes, was also a list of real victims. And that actually was really useful because for law enforcement to open an investigation, they need to find a victim that's in the right jurisdiction and that's also willing to press charges. And on our side, we were actually able to contact some of those victims to ask for technical assistance to understand better what was going on with their servers. Some victims never bothered to answer us or even to clean up their infected servers, but some were much more cooperative. We even got root access on a few servers just by asking nicely. And something worth mentioning is that Ibery was designed to exfiltrate the stolen credentials to specific exfiltration servers, to which the attackers would later connect to and just fetch the data. Now, those servers were also running off of compromised hosts. And believe it or not, for about 5 days, we were root on one of those nodes. And so we could see in real time the stolen credentials come in. So not only did we have a list of current victims, we also had a list of future ones whose credentials just got compromised. And overall, in those 5 days, we saw about 5,000 unique valid credentials. About 40 of these were for the root username. So just in 5 days, and imagine the Wendigo operation went on for years. And so, of course, that is also information that we shared with the FBI to fuel their investigation. But we still had one question to answer. What was the actual purpose of the attack, besides just stealing SSH credentials and infecting more servers to steal more credentials and so forth? So answering that question is always crucial in an investigation. So for one thing, it allows to establish the extent of the damages sustained by the victims, but it can also point to a money trail that law enforcement might be able to follow and eventually find the true identity of the people behind the attack, those actually getting the money out of the operation. And that's when our in-depth analysis of Cdork and Calfbot became useful. So let's start with Cdork, which was deployed on infected web servers to redirect visitors to unwanted content. The most common redirection was to send the visitors to an exploit kit that attempted to drop one of two Windows malware. There was Boax, which is a specialized malware doing ad fraud, and Glupteba, a generic proxy. Just for reference, the first exploit kit used was Black Hole, and it was followed by Neutrino shortly after the Black Hole alleged author was arrested. And we observed about 1% of the visitors being redirected to the exploit kit getting successfully infected and by one of those two Windows malware, and most of the remaining visitors just got redirected to online ads. And now Calfbot, which was deployed mostly on infected mail servers, was of course used to send spam. And what we did is we wrote a custom bot that emulated the communication protocol. And doing that, we were able to acquire spam jobs directly from the C2s and automate the monitoring of what we were told to push. And our analysis of the Cdork redirections to ad networks combined with the URLs included in the spam sent by Calfbot, we confirmed that the operators were making money off of their botnet through affiliate programs, mostly for online gambling, dating websites, and adult content. So in other words, legitimate websites were paying the Wendigo operators for every visitor they drove to those websites. Of course, they never knew that that traffic was fraudulent and totally worthless. And as Robert mentioned, so Calfbot at some point was sending tens of millions of spam every day. And we were able to monitor all this Cdork redirections, and that reached 500,000 of web queries per day at a certain point during our investigation. And so what we did is we aggregated all those affiliate links coming from all these sources and shared that with the FBI, who followed the money trail, because real money was paid by real businesses for this traffic. So eventually that money needed to be extracted and deposited in bank accounts. And so after that phase, things went really quiet. We didn't hear back for several months until we learned in the news that Maxim Senak, a Russian citizen, was formally identified as a co-conspirator behind Operation Wendigo and that he got indicted by the US and actually arrested in Finland. So I want to pause here and just take a moment to emphasize this. People often hear that going after cyber criminals is a waste of time because they live in countries where they are untouchable. And in fact, it's true that many countries are relatively safe for cyber criminal to live in. But regardless, getting an indictment is a life-altering event. It means that for the person targeted, visiting a certain number of countries will lead to at least a temporary arrest, questioning, and running the risk of getting extradited. And this is exactly what happened in this case. So Senak traveled to Finland to visit a relative, and the indictment happened while he was still traveling. So when he was about to leave Finland to go back to Russia, that's when the Finnish authorities were able to arrest him. And eventually the US filed an extradition request to the Finnish government, who agreed to it. So Senak was given a one-way ticket to the US to face justice. And he rapidly pleaded non-guilty. And this is when we were brought back in this case. Because a non-guilty plea meant that there would be a trial. And the US prosecutors needed an expert witness to explain to the court everything about Operation Wendigo. And naturally, they asked us to be that expert witness and to testify in open court. Now, remember that big diagram from before with all the components of Operation Wendigo? Well, it was hard enough to explain that to other malware researchers. Now, imagine the task to explain that to a team of lawyers and prosecutors and eventually to a judge who are not familiar with the computer science at all. And so we flew our main researcher to Minneapolis for a full 2-day briefing with the team in charge of the prosecution, going page after page of our 69-page long white paper, explaining the basics, such as what an IP address is and what is the purpose of the SSH protocol, and slowly moving up to how the operation was structured and monetized. And that's important because just doing malware research it's really technical work, of course, and it's necessary to do those investigations. But we have to understand that it comes with a certain responsibility to be able to explain the findings to law enforcement in a way they can understand, and eventually to lawyers and a judge for all those investigations to have an effect. But in this case, though, we ended up not having to testify because Senak decided to plead guilty to a reduced set of charges, which meant no trial would be necessary. And in the end, he got sentenced to 46 months in a federal US prison. And so just a few closing remarks. Investing cybercrime, this is not new information. It's complex. It requires lots of different expertise to come in together. And it's pretty impossible to do in isolation. So you saw what private sector can contribute to joint investigation: technical expertise, intelligence, raw data. But it's important to mention what law enforcement brings to the table. Law enforcement has, of course, police powers. They can get warrants to obtain information that is absolutely out of reach for private companies. Imagine net flow data, disk images, things like that. And law enforcement has police expertise, for example, to follow money trail and eventually identify suspects and bring them to justice. So when you think about it, law enforcement and private sector working together just makes so much sense. In the end, we all have the same objective, which is to stop cybercrime. And one last thing about trust. Trust is at the core and center of cybersecurity. You probably all know it. And when private industry works with law enforcement partners, trust is even more important. From the private sector, we have to trust that law enforcement will actually use and take action on the information that we put together and share. Otherwise, we would just be wasting our time, right? We also need to trust that that information will not be shared to other parties who might misuse it for their own benefit, for example. And on the other hand, law enforcement has to trust that the information coming from their private partners is thorough and 100% accurate. And the only way we found so far to reach that a good or the maximum level of trust is to start in small cooperation and to build up as time goes, and to, at every step of the way, all the time, to act fairly and ethically with all the partners involved. So thank you for your attention, and we have a few minutes for question, hopefully.
Yeah, we have just a couple minutes. Thank you so much. I love ending on that note. And I mean, I think that's what we've all found in this community is, right, the only way that we're gonna succeed is by cooperating, but building that trust is absolutely key. And I agree with you. I think it happens over time. So a couple questions. If anyone else has questions, you can throw those in the Q&A panel. One that came in, and then I'm kind of curious as well about thinking about all of the different jurisdictions that you mentioned, you know, global law enforcement, public-private companies. Could you talk a little bit about how you deconflict? Is that something that you as private researchers do? Do you kind of push things one way? How do you deconflict given all of these different jurisdictions?
Maybe I can try and answer that.
Yeah.
It's a fundamentally hard problem. Sometimes even in a single organization, it's hard to do. So imagine when several organizations are spread across the world, and it's actually not how to say it. It's not something that is easy to do from a private sector perspective, and we don't put too much energy into that. We kind of rely on law enforcement to have more insight on that aspect. So we kind of rely on, for example, the FBI to know if there's another federal investigation happening at the same time on the same topic.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because, right, you as a private company, ideally, if law enforcement is sort of the hub, and then each of the private companies are spokes, like you'd hope that law enforcement's cooperating globally, which I think you've given evidence has happened in the past. So
yeah, I'll just quickly add on that. I agree with what was said, that it's mostly the law enforcement agencies making sure that taking care of the jurisdictional aspect of things. And we often cooperate, for example, with not local law enforcement agencies in every individual small country, but like cross-border organizations, you know, such as Europol, which are, you know, cross-border, so like larger law enforcement organizations, which then, as was said, should be aware of, you know, the jurisdictional aspect of things.
Absolutely. Excellent. Well, I think we are running short on time. So I would say if anyone else has other questions, they can probably just do an @ESET Research, or I know you both are on Twitter. So if anyone has questions, you know, there's one on the racing matrix. So feel free to just tweet anyone if you have additional questions. So just to kind of give a few final thoughts as we wrap up, a couple action items. We always have some go-do things based on what Robert and Alexi have talked about. Right, there were a lot of technical takeaways in there. I tweeted some things about even just looking at the process for bringing in malware samples. How do you automate some of that? How do you do manual research there? Think about how you could apply that, or, you know, some of the methodology that Robert and Alexi talked about in your own networks. How can you identify if you're part of a botnet? Another, you know, takeaway as we were wrapping up, right? You got to have these contacts to be able to participate in global takedowns like this. So I would suggest, you know, if you don't already know someone in law enforcement, or if you're in law enforcement, you don't have private sector contacts, develop those contacts early. And I love the recommendation to start small. You know, maybe start, hey, we saw this, you know, can we connect some people, and then build from there where you can have a huge impact on these global takedown operations. Another thing I'd highlight is, remember, right, as, you know, Alexi and Robert have talked about, they only saw a piece of the puzzle, maybe thousands of victims, but other agencies, other partners might see more. So think about that, and how by working together, we can all kind of piece together what we're seeing. And as I think we've seen today, have a huge impact on these adversaries. And last but not least, a lot to take in from today, a lot happening this week. So I just say for everyone, regardless of what holiday you celebrate, please take some time, relax, take care of yourself. There's a lot happening in this community, but please take time to relax. And we're in this for the long haul. So with that, couple references. Again, these slides will be available on the page where you registered. along with the recording. So if you'd like to share this out with your colleagues, your friends, family, whoever, this will be available in the next couple of days. So keep an eye on the page where you registered for the recording. And with that, thank you, Robert, Alexis, so much for coming and sharing today. Take care, everyone. Be well, and we hope to see you at a future webcast.
Thanks for having us. Stay safe.